Carol Burnett spent 50 years inside the American entertainment industry. 50 years of working alongside the men and women whose names defined Hollywood's golden age. And in 4 published memoirs, across hundreds of interviews and decades of public appearances, she never once named the colleagues whose documented records would have justified every accusation. That silence was not ignorance. It was a choice. Because Burnett did not need to make accusations. She made bookings. While the industry she worked inside had been architecturally designed by men who considered black performers culturally inferior and politically threatening, Burnett put Sammy Davis Jr. on her stage as a creative equal. She gave Pearl Bailey ensemble sketch work alongside her regular cast. She booked Lena Horne. She did the work the documented racists had refused to do. And she did it quietly, consistently, for 5 decades, while the men whose institutional choices had built the segregated system she was quietly dismantling continued to be celebrated as the architects of American cinema's greatest era. This video is about those men and one woman, 5 figures whose documented records, congressional testimony, organizational membership rolls, academic biographies, and the films themselves establish the specific, verifiable contours of their racism. Not rumors, not gossip, not innuendo. Congressional records, court-documented organizational rosters, peer-reviewed academic biographies. The films themselves, which you can watch today and see exactly what choices were made and when. Every figure in this video operated within professional proximity to Carol Burnett's career. Every figure helped design or maintain the segregated entertainment system that her closest black friends and colleagues spent their professional lives navigating. Every claim made here traces to documented public record. Stay until the end. Because the 5th name on this list did not just participate in Hollywood racism, he invented the visual language of it, and the consequences of that invention are still being measured. Carol Burnett's career began in 1959 on The Gary Moore Show, and stretched across the next 5 decades without interruption. Her landmark run on The Carol Burnett Show from 1967 to 1978 made her one of the most recognized entertainers in American television history. 4 published memoirs, the most recent of which, In Such Good Company, came out in 2016, give her one of the most thoroughly documented internal perspectives on the mid-century entertainment industry that any performer of her era ever committed to print. What those memoirs reveal, between their lines and occasionally in direct documentation, is a woman who understood exactly what the industry she had spent her life inside had been designed to do, and who had spent 50 years doing the opposite. The figures in this video are not obscure. 3 of them won Academy Awards. One of them directed more Best Director Oscars than any filmmaker in Hollywood history. One of them controlled the early career of the highest-paid actress in Hollywood. Their names are in the textbooks, their films are in the archives, and the documented record of their institutional racism is in the same publicly accessible archives where anyone can find it. These are the 5 most documented racist figures in old Hollywood whose careers placed them in unavoidable professional proximity to Carol Burnett's world, and to the black colleagues she spent 50 years fighting to keep on her stage. Number 5. Robert Taylor, the leading man who named names. For 3 unbroken decades, Robert Taylor was Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer's most reliable leading man. The dark-haired, classically handsome features that made him one of the studio's most bankable assets put him opposite Greta Garbo in Camille, carried him through Magnificent Obsession and Quo Vadis, and planted him at the center of Hollywood's most photographed celebrity pairings when he married Barbara Stanwyck in 1939. That marriage lasted until 1951, and its visibility reinforced the image of stable American masculine respectability that MGM had spent 2 decades building around him. He stayed under contract at the studio for 24 unbroken years. A tenure that tells you everything about how valuable the studio considered that image and how carefully Taylor protected it. The congressional record tells a different story. In October 1947, Robert Taylor appeared before the House Un-American Activities Committee as a friendly witness. He became the only major Hollywood leading man of his era to name names, to go before a congressional committee and identify specific colleagues by name as suspected communists. He named screenwriter Howard Da Silva. He named actress Karen Morley. He named them in sworn congressional testimony, in public record, in a hearing whose transcripts remain accessible in public archives today. The consequences arrived immediately. Both Da Silva and Morley found themselves blacklisted from Hollywood as a direct result of Taylor's testimony. Da Silva waited 14 years before appearing in another major Hollywood film. His return came in 1961. Karen Morley waited even longer, with her return to American film work not arriving until after 1970. Careers measured in decades ended by testimony that Robert Taylor gave voluntarily as a friendly witness before a congressional committee he was not required to appear before. His participation in the Motion Picture Alliance for the Preservation of American Ideals adds institutional dimension to what the congressional record documents. Taylor was a co-founder of the Alliance, established in 1944 alongside John Wayne, Walt Disney, Cecil B. DeMille, Hedda Hopper, Ginger Rogers, Ronald Reagan, Adolphe Menjou, Ward Bond, and Ayn Rand. The Alliance was not a political organization with racial dimensions as an incidental byproduct. It was the coordinating body for what became a 15-year campaign to destroy the careers of writers, directors, and performers, whose politics its membership found unacceptable. The Alliance supplied the vast majority of friendly witnesses to the HUAC investigations. It operated the institutional machinery that the Hollywood Blacklist was built on. The racial politics of that machinery were not incidental to its purpose. The artists the Alliance targeted with greatest intensity included black performers like Paul Robeson, whose career the Blacklist effectively ended entirely, and the progressive white artists, whose work had spent the 1930s and 1940s challenging the segregated assumptions of mid-century American cinema. The integrationist coalition that Robeson and his contemporaries had spent years building was precisely what the Alliance's program was designed to destroy. Robert Taylor's testimony was a documented act of institutional violence against that coalition, and the careers it ended were not abstract casualties. They were specific people whose names are in the congressional record alongside Taylor's. The Sammy Davis Jr.'s and Pearl Baileys, whom Burnett would insist on booking on her variety stage, spent their careers navigating an industry whose institutional architecture had been partly designed by figures like Taylor. Men who used their cultural authority and their MGM contracts and their respectable public images to build the machinery that kept progressive voices, and the integrationist work those voices were doing, off of American screens. Taylor's October 1947 congressional testimony is in the public record. His own words about the careers he was helping to end are there for anyone who wants to read them. Number 4. Charles Coburn. The beloved character, actor, and the White Citizens Council. No entry in the documented record of old Hollywood racism unsettles more thoroughly than Charles Coburn, because Coburn's public image was built on precisely the qualities that make institutional racism most dangerous when it hides behind them. Coburn was not a villain on screen. He was the warm grandfather, the gruff but fundamentally kindly older man, the lovable patriarchal presence whose decency was the point of every role he played. His 3 Academy Award nominations and his 1944 Oscar win for The More the Merrier established him as one of the most beloved supporting performers of his era. The Devil and Miss Jones gave audiences one of the period's most warmly human character studies. Coburn's screen persona was built on the projection of benevolent wisdom and the suggestion that here was a man whose essential goodness was self-evident. The documented record of his off-screen commitments stands in active, total contradiction to that persona. Charles Coburn carried membership in the White Citizens Council, the network of white supremacist organizations founded in 1954, specifically in response to the Brown v. Board of Education Supreme Court decision that had ordered the desegregation of American public schools. The White Citizens Council was not a political organization with racial dimensions. It was not a civic group, with some members who held regrettable views. It was founded for one purpose: the maintenance of racial segregation and the organized opposition to the civil rights movement across the American South. The desegregation of schools, the extension of basic civil rights to Black Americans. The White Citizens Council existed to prevent those things from happening. Through economic pressure against integrationist activists, organized opposition to school desegregation, and coordinated political action against civil rights legislation at every level of American government. The organization was sometimes called the White Collar Klan, and the description captured its operational logic precisely. Where the Klan worked through nighttime violence and the terror of physical threat, the Citizens' Councils worked through daytime professional networks and middle-class respectability. Membership was not a secret or a source of shame. It was a public declaration of political commitment, and Coburn joined openly. Born in Macon, Georgia in 1877 and raised in Savannah during the era when Jim Crow segregation was being legally and socially constructed across the South, Coburn carried the racial politics of that formation with him into Hollywood. When the White Citizens Council network emerged in 1954, his membership placed him formally within the white supremacist coalition, fighting against every advance the civil rights movement was attempting to make. His role as vice president of the Motion Picture Alliance for the Preservation of American Ideals, the same organization Robert Taylor had co-founded a decade earlier, adds the institutional Hollywood dimension to what the council membership documents at the level of explicit ideological commitment. Coburn deployed his Oscar winner credibility and his beloved character actor respectability to help build the institutional machinery that destroyed the careers of progressive writers and performers inside the industry. And his White Citizens Council membership made the broader political project he was serving unmistakably clear. The Pearl Baileys and Sammy Davis Jr.'s, whose talent Burnett fought to put on her stage, were exactly the kind of artists whose cultural and civic standing the White Citizens Council's program had been designed to suppress. Coburn's membership placed him not at the fringe of that project, but at its respectable, publicly visible, organizational center. Number 3. John Ford, the director who filmed himself as a Klansman. For half a century, John Ford defined the visual language of the American Western. Approximately 140 films across a career that spanned the entirety of American cinema's first century. A record 4 Academy Awards for Best Director, for The Informer, The Grapes of Wrath, How Green Was My Valley, and The Quiet Man. Collaborations with John Wayne across The Searchers, Stagecoach, Fort Apache, and more than 20 other productions that created the most influential body of work in the history of the Western genre. When critics and historians discuss the foundations of American cinema, Ford's name is unavoidable. The documented record of his relationship to American racism begins before any of those achievements. It begins in 1915, on the set of D.W. Griffith's The Birth of a Nation. The young Ford appeared on screen in Griffith's film as one of the Klansmen riding to rescue the threatened white population from the supposedly savage black Union soldiers depicted in the film's climactic final sequence. His appearance is not speculation or inference. It is documented in Joseph McBride's authoritative 2001 biography, Searching for John Ford, a peer-reviewed academic study, where Ford himself confirmed his participation in Griffith's film to McBride directly. He appeared on camera as a Klansman in what would become the most aggressively white supremacist major film in American cinema history, and he confirmed that appearance in his own words to his own biographer. The Confederate sympathy that defined so much of his subsequent directorial output was not incidental or subtle. His 1934 film Judge Priest deployed Stepin Fetchit in the demeaning roles that civil rights activists had been protesting for decades. The shuffling, mumbling, supposedly lazy black caricature whose entire performance framework was built on the projection of black intellectual and moral inferiority. Ford directed Fetch It in Judge Priest and returned to direct him again in the 1935 production Steamboat Round the Bend. These were not inherited studio decisions Ford had no control over. They were active, creative choices he made, and then repeated. The Native American depictions across his Western catalog established the cinematic template that would shape American audience understanding of indigenous peoples for the next half-century. Stagecoach in 1939 portrayed Apaches as faceless, threatening savages whose only narrative function was to menace the white travelers whose individual humanity the film developed carefully and at length. The Searchers in 1956, routinely celebrated as Ford's masterpiece and one of the greatest American films ever made, treated its Comanche characters as instruments of plot rather than as people, with John Wayne's racist Ethan Edwards searching obsessively for his abducted niece across a Western landscape whose indigenous inhabitants existed primarily as obstacles to his pursuit. The most specifically documented evidence of Ford's racism in his late career involves his treatment of black actor Woody Strode across multiple productions in the 1960s. Not 1932, not 1942, but 1962, at the height of the American Civil Rights Movement, Ford directed his film to have white characters repeatedly address Strode's character as boy. Number 2. Layla Rogers, the stage mother who built the Blacklist. For 25 years, Layla Rogers was one of the most institutionally powerful women in the Hollywood studio system. As Charles Kerner's assistant and head of new talent development at RKO Pictures from 1938 to 1945, she exercised gatekeeping authority over who would and would not be welcomed into the industry during the precise years when the Motion Picture Alliance was building the political infrastructure that would become the Hollywood Blacklist. She controlled the early career of her daughter Ginger Rogers, across the actress's rise to become the highest-paid star in Hollywood in 1945. And she used the institutional leverage that combination of positions gave her with documented aggression. The documented record of her institutional role anchors itself in two specific facts that are not in dispute. The first is her status as a founding member of the Motion Picture Alliance for the Preservation of American Ideals from its 1944 establishment, placing her at the organizational center of the Blacklist apparatus from its founding moment. The second is her appearance as a friendly witness before the House Un-American Activities Committee on October 23, 1947. Her testimony is preserved in the congressional record and discussed at length in Thomas Doherty's academic study, Show Trial, Hollywood, HUAC, and the Birth of the Blacklist. She named writers and directors in that testimony. The careers of the people she named were destroyed as a direct result. Among the writers she helped destroy was Dalton Trumbo. Layla Rogers cited Trumbo's 1943 script for the film Tender Comrade in her HUAC testimony as evidence of communist propaganda, specifically pointing to the line, "share and share alike," as proof of subversive intent. Trumbo was blacklisted from Hollywood for over a decade as a direct consequence of the campaign Rogers and her Empire colleagues conducted. His return to credited work in 1960 required the public courage of Kirk Douglas and Otto Preminger to break the blacklist that Rogers had helped build. A blacklist that had been enforced for 13 years on the basis of congressional testimony that Layla Rogers had delivered voluntarily. Her radio appearances during the same period reinforced the documentary record. In September 1947, she broadcast on America's Town Meeting of the Air from the Los Angeles Philharmonic Auditorium, publicly accusing communist threats embedded throughout the Screenwriters Guild. The institutional and the public dimensions of her campaign were not separate activities, they were coordinated. Number 1. D.W. Griffith, the director who built racist cinema. No entry in the documented record of American cinematic racism is more foundational than D.W. Griffith, because Griffith did not simply participate in the racist conventions of his era. He created the visual language that every subsequent racist filmmaker would inherit. Across his early career, Griffith refined the editing techniques, the narrative structures, and the dramatic conventions that would define the technical possibilities of motion pictures for the next century. He invented the tools of cinema as an art form. And then he deployed that entire technical vocabulary, every editing innovation, every narrative convention, every dramatic tool he had spent years developing, in service of the most aggressively white supremacist major film the American studio system has ever produced. The Birth of a Nation was released in 1915. The Nake protest campaign that emerged in direct response to the film's premiere represents the first major civil rights mobilization against an American film, documented in Melvin Stokes' 2007 Oxford University Press academic study, D.W. Griffith's The Birth of a Nation, a history of the most controversial motion picture of all time. Civil rights organizations recognized within weeks of the film's release that Griffith had produced something more dangerous than ordinary racist entertainment. The film portrayed the Ku Klux Klan as heroic defenders of white womanhood against the depredations of freed black men, depicted as savage threats to the Reconstruction-era South. It cast white actors in blackface to play the most aggressive black characters. It presented the founding of the Klan as a noble historical achievement. It structured its entire 3-hour narrative around the proposition that the post-Civil War South required the Klan's organized violence to be redeemed from what Griffith presented as the catastrophe of Reconstruction-era black political participation. The film was not ambiguous about its argument. It made that argument in the clearest possible cinematic terms, using every technical innovation Griffith had spent his career developing. In February 1915, President Woodrow Wilson screened The Birth of a Nation at the White House, marking the first film ever screened in the Executive Mansion. The film directly inspired the 1915 revival of the Ku Klux Klan as a mass organization. The second-wave Klan that emerged from its cultural impact grew to over 4 million members by the mid-1920s. Becoming the dominant political force across multiple American states and conducting an extended campaign of organized racial terror, whose direct cultural lineage traced back to the permission Griffith's film had provided. That is not an inference drawn by critics. It is a documented historical consequence of a specific film's specific cultural impact. When the NARC mounted its protest campaign against The Birth of a Nation, Griffith responded in 1916 by publishing a pamphlet titled The Rise and Fall of Free Speech in America, treating civil rights opposition to his white supremacist film as itself a form of censorship that the principle of artistic freedom required him to resist. He framed his right to make a film celebrating the Klan as a free speech issue. He did this in public, in a published document, under his own name. 5 names. 50 years of documented record. Carol Burnett never named any of them publicly. The gentle public voice that defined her career across 4 memoirs and 50 years of interviews has declined to deliver the kind of direct accusation that the documented record would have justified. And that refusal was deliberate. Her role was never to be the prosecutor. Her role was to be the alternative, the entertainer whose stage refused to participate in the cinematic vocabulary D.W. Griffith had created, whose booking choices rejected the institutional gatekeeping Layla Rogers had practiced, whose creative collaborations with Sammy Davis Jr. and Pearl Bailey and Lena Horne refused the racial assumptions Charles Coburn had organized politically to defend. She did the work the documented racists had refused to do. Across 50 years of consistent, quiet, professional refusal, her contemporaries noticed, even when her gentle voice declined to spell out the meaning. Which of these 5 documented records surprised you most? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this exploration of Hollywood's hidden history valuable, like and subscribe for more untold stories from entertainment's complicated past.